Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inna alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Amma ba'd. Okay, thank you so much, Ustad Mubashir, for that wonderful reminder on why it's important to keep that focus on the Sunnah. So, today's talk is primarily about what the Sunnah is not. And so, I was really glad that Mubashir was able to tell us a little bit, remind us actually, really, what the Sunnah is. And I think as Mubashir said, it'd be really useful if, we all took a little bit of time out to read some of these, sometimes quite relatively short books that just remind you of, wow, there is such a inspiring and kind of guiding legacy in the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's sometimes because some of these other stories, narrations about the Prophet arrive that you end up starting to doubt, possibly who the Prophet was and what he was sent for. And that's what we'll look at in more detail, inshallah, today. So, as a recap, this is what we've been doing up till now. Okay, we have so far, certainly in our section on Hadith in the past few weeks, established that from very early on, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ onwards, and really honestly around soon after the time of the Prophet, people were passing on narrations about the Prophet. They'd seen the Prophet, they knew the Prophet, they were talking about him. Of course they were, because the Quran explains that he is uswatun hasana, he's an excellent example. And as such, of course, people want to know, well, what was this example? So those who saw him knew him, and they taught those who didn't see him, even to the point where companions would pass on accounts of the Prophet amongst each other. Okay. We know also that it's unreasonable. In fact, it's actually preposterous, pretty much, from an academic point of view, from a sort of scientific historical point of view, to say that everything about the Prophet was fabricated. So you have the example of Golzai Shacht that we studied before, who said that, okay, Quran, okay, there may be some elements of the Hadith here and there that might have remained, but the bulk of what we have today, and is called authentic, is fabricated, and then so far as people to go further and actually say that no, actually Muhammad didn't even exist, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and everything is made up, including the Quran and everything. And we've looked at how even through archaeological evidence, carbon dated papyri with the kind of the Arabic script that's chosen, etc., that verifies its dates, that actually it's preposterous to suggest that, quite honestly. Okay, what we do know, however, is that there was a lot of fabrication that occurred, and very early on. So as soon as there was that horrible fitna of even the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, and then certainly when during the time of the conflict between Ali and Muawiyah radiallahu anhuma, that a lot of fabrication started to come along, and some of those were politically motivated. But then after that, fabrications occurred for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes people just liked to get a crowd. So, there's lots of stories of people who would just gather in mosques, and after prayers, they'd just stand up and start telling fanciful stories. And in there, they would have fanciful hadith made up as well, just to get a crowd. Okay. And then there were other people who actually sincerely fabricated. And then there were others who were hadith narrators who maybe, thought, well, this is okay, it sounds reasonable. I know the person was not maybe the best narrator in the world, but he sounds like a sincere guy, and I'll take from him, pass on. So you can see how into the kind of tradition of hadith literature, you could get some weaker narrations trickling in as well. Okay. At the same time, we know that as soon as the Sunnah had been safeguarded, so Imams Malik and Abu Hanifa concentrated, rather than just concentrate directly on Hadith, their focus was on the example, the life of the Prophet. How can we capture that guidance, write it down, record it for posterity, and talk about the elements of the guidance that will help people in their practical lives. So this was the Sunnah as a whole, okay? And that obviously correlated with Hadith, but it wasn't just Hadith. Once they'd safeguarded that, then the next generation, so Imam Malik safeguarded the Sunnah through the Amal of Medina. We know about that, you know, the practice of the people of Medina. But his student, Imam Ahmad, so, okay, well, that's sorted, that's secured. They then took on the challenge of, before, you know, Hadith get forgotten and lost into the, you know, the kind of, you know, the ether of time and history, let's make an absolutely careful point of noting down all the Hadith. So Imam Ahmad did this phenomenal effort of sifting through all the fabricated stuff to write down any Hadith that he thought had a reasonable chance of being from the Prophet. You know, wasn't careful about being absolutely exact about their authority, okay, but the Hadith had to have a reasonable chance. They had a good chain of narration, reasonable narrators in there, put it down, okay, and he created his Musnad with 30,000 Hadith. His student was Imam Bukhari. I mean, of course, these people, Imam Bukhari certainly, well, Imam Ahmad as well, started to do the rihla, which is traveling for Hadith. And Imam Bukhari said, okay, now we've got all the Hadith, that's fine. Let's gather the most authentic, right? So what you have is, okay, a massive body of Hadith, many of which are fabricated, but then these Imams, these people of phenomenal intellect, piety, dedication, who then went through the effort of sifting through this to try and work out, you know, which of it was most authoritative, okay? And you know, so Imam Bukhari, in order to establish what is authentic, had to devise some very strict criteria. Imam Muslim, who was a student, had slightly different criteria, and in some ways, you know, in theory, more exacting. So, for instance, he would only accept a hadith if there were two corroborating independent chains there, right? So, this is, you know, this is where we've got to so far. What were the steps that the Imams went through in establishing the validity of hadith, right? So, the first thing that they did is they obviously searched for all the hadith they could find on a subject, okay? And a hadith, remember, it has two parts. It has like the head and the tail, right? So the head is the content of the hadith, the actual saying of the Prophet. But any saying of the Prophet has no validity until you know who told you, right? So that's the chain, is, okay, how do you know the Prophet said it? Because I heard it from so-and-so, who heard it from so-and-so, who heard it from so-and-so, who heard the Prophet say, right? A companion who heard the Prophet say. So that's a chain, sanad, you might say, okay? So they collected these, and they established a tradition, essentially, of rihla at this stage in our history, of traveling far and wide across what was already a vast empire, and the teachings of the Prophet and the people who carried the teachings of the Prophet had traveled as well. We know the companions had traveled, and so, you know, their students were in all parts of the empire, you might say, or the Khilafah, right? And what they also did, which was crucial, is scrutinize the biographies of all the narrators, because by the time of Imam Bukhari, a few generations had passed since the Prophet. Remember last time, the week before last, when I was talking last, we talked about how you know, Imam Malik was taught by people who were taught by the companions, and Imam Malik taught Imam Ahmad, and Imam Ahmad taught Imam Bukhari, right? So you can see that, you know, there's a few generations there, but these are generations in which there are people of phenomenal caliber and phenomenal piety and scrutiny, to take the hadith from, right? So the biographies are extend into volumes, and Imam Bukhari, for instance, in his teenagers started writing huge volumes of biographies of the hadith narrators, in order to validate the hadith. There's no point having a list of names if you don't even know who these people were, right? That was important. Then they had to ensure that the chain was continuous, so that each of the nodes, the people in that chain, had definitely learned from each other. So were they alive did their lifespans overlap? Were they in the same cities at the same time? And is there any evidence that they actually learned from each other? So that was checked as well, okay? And then after that, you needed to know the quality of the narrators. Do they have a good character? Beyond that, do they have a good understanding of the religion? Are they sheikhs? Are they imams? And then what was the quality of their memory like? And, you know, you could say that this is all very personal information, but in order to validate and the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, you had to go through this kind of effort, right? So this is the stuff that we've covered. There is a further standard which the muhaddithun did apply, but variably, okay? And in some ways, you can't blame them. So for instance, Imam Muslim would take lots of hadith as long as the chain was good. He took the content, okay? Because in many ways, you know, he could say, well, my job at this stage is, before the knowledge disappears, to get the information about the Prophet down whenever there's a good chain for it, or two good chains minimum. Okay, I'm going to get it down. Okay, other people later can scrutinize it and ask questions about it if they want to. Because the seventh standard in this list is that they are supposed to also have checked for any irregularities in the content. So they scrutinized the chain with phenomenal precision. Okay, the Imams did. You know, not everybody, but the Imams did. But then after that, somebody should also look at the text itself, okay, the Matn, as it's called. And that's what today's talk is about, is the analysis of the Matn, the content, to see, well, okay, how does that fit? You know, is it how probable? We've checked the probability of it being from the Prophet by chain, but can we check the probability of it being by the Prophet from the content as well? Right. So, for instance, Imam Ibn al-Qayyim, who we mentioned before, was a phenomenal Hanbali scholar of the past. You know, I mean, he's a man of his context. We're not going to say that, you know, everything he said was brilliant, but of course, you know, he said some amazing things. And one thing he said in terms of how to validate a hadith is that the hadith. So these are his points. Okay, that the hadith has to contain. That if the hadith contains an exaggerated statement about the Prophet that, you know, was not really possible for him to have made, it's just he doesn't exaggerate to that degree, you know, then you reject it. So for instance, a hadith where, you know, you pronounce La ilaha illallah and God creates a bird which has 70,000 tongues, you know, it just doesn't make sense, and it seems quite far-fetched. And then if experiments reject it, which means that basically it's against scientific facts, right? If it's a ridiculous kind of attribution, it just sounds too ridiculous to be attributed to a prophet of God, to the final messenger, right? If it contradicts well-known sunnah, if it attributes a statement to the prophet which just doesn't make sense. So for instance, the example he's giving here is that, you know, thousands of companions, or 1,000 companions, heard this saying, but none of the companions related it. They concealed it. Okay, but now I have this hadith of the Prophet. It's like, you know, come on, sort of thing, you know. And then if the statement doesn't sound like the language or the style of the Prophet, yeah, it's not consistent with the Sunnah, all the other teachings of the Prophet. If it contradicts the Quran, okay, clear, obvious meanings of the Quran, or if it's been stated by mystics or medical practitioners. So you can see that classical scholars would say you've got to check the content of the hadith as well, right? And Muhammad Zubair Siddiqui, who's brilliant book published by the Islamic Text Society here, definitely worth reading. Okay, so he mentions these criteria as well. It's essentially the same as Ibn al-Qayyim's criteria, that it mustn't contradict the Quran, it's got to not contradict reason or the laws of nature or common experience, not placing disproportionate rewards, exaggeration basically, on either insignificant good deeds or exaggerated punishment for insignificant misdemeanors, right? And then sometimes there are hadith that would ascribe excessive virtues to individuals or to places. So for instance, Imam Ibn Majah in his collection has a hadith about how brilliant his place Qazwin was, which is some place in sort of around Iran sort of area. Okay, but it just seemed to be kind of inconsistent with what you'd expect in a hadith. All right. Also, prophecies of the future, if they're too detailed, especially if they've got actual dates on them as well, that's not consistent with an authentic. It's an improbable hadith, right? And then things that aren't connected to the Prophet's vocation or consistent with his teachings, right? And then, of course, just if the grammar is all to pot, that's just not the style of the Prophet. And so what Siddiqui says is that it is on account of these principles that a large number of traditions, which are included in some sound hadith collections, have been rejected by the compilers of standard collections of traditions. And then there are other books which are actually written about fabricated hadith. So Ibn al-Qayyim, for instance, and Ibn al-Jawzi, Imam Shawkani has apparently done a very, very good one where he not only mentions it, but he actually goes through the effort of, rather than just rejecting the hadith because it's just incoherent or improbable, irregular, but actually goes into the chain and finds some fault in the chain. That someone who, maybe the Imam that's collecting the hadith thought was okay, but lots of other people have got other information about that narrator and say, no, I don't think so, right? Now, the question is, why do we need to do this? If we've got Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, why ask questions about some of the hadith in Sahih Muslim and Bukhari? Why isn't it okay just to follow all the hadith and be happy, be good, pious Muslims, not worry at all, huh? And that's an approach that a lot of people have. If they don't have an issue with this and they want to live with them, that's fine. I don't think it's really in our position to argue against such people. Okay. The only thing I would say is that it's helpful for a lot of people if we can maintain the classical approach, which is to be critical when a hadith doesn't fit with the character of the Prophet. Okay. Let me give you an example. So I found this on social media. Some other people, I'm sure, will have also seen this. Okay, I don't know if it's actually come from our lovely scholar Mufti Menk. Okay, it might have come from him, might not. It could be anyone that puts this together really and starts passing along on WhatsApp. Now they're basing this advice on the black seed is healing for all diseases except death. And that's from the Prophet ﷺ in Bukhari. Okay, so the black seed heals everything except death. So this graphic was sent out on WhatsApp, went viral presumably, saying that, look, if you get ill with coronavirus, just use black seed in its various forms. So if you have breathing difficulty, inhale black seed. Right, steam inhaled with essence of black seed. Okay, now this is where I have an issue. Right, as a doctor, I could never forward something like this or be happy to accept it, because if you're having difficulty breathing with coronavirus, you need to be seeking medical advice. You must not just inhale essence of black seed. Okay, not acceptable, because you could deteriorate quickly. It could cost your life. Okay, you could spend a week just inhaling black seed, saying, no, I'll get better, inshallah. I believe in that hadith. The Prophet was true. He was sent by God, final messenger. I believe everything he says. He said that the black seed will cure it. Okay, just absolutely cannot accept that. Okay, so that's the danger with hadith of this nature. Okay, and then you have things like this. So in this hadith, you've got two companions who have narrated, and this is a hadith in Bukhari, also in Muslim as well, actually, that the Prophet ﷺ, went to the women folk and addressed them and said, "Oh, women, do charity work. I've been shown that most of the residents of hell are women." And they said, why is that? And the Prophet said, you do too much cursing and are often unfaithful to your family, as like your husbands. I have not seen any intellectually and religiously deficient creature as harmful for men as you are. And then they asked the Prophet, in what way are we intellectually and religiously deficient? And he explained his reasoning, supposedly. Okay, now look, I mean, we'll look into this hadith in a little while, but the bottom line is, people are going to look at that hadith. Many women, hopefully many men as well, I hope, and feel a little bit of consternation. And many people will have seen, content like this attributed to the Prophet, and it will have made their faith waver, because they're saying, really, did my Prophet really say that? If he said that, I'm not sure that I can, reconcile myself to taking him as a teacher. Do you know what I mean? So these things can actually cause major crises of faith, and I think that's an important reason why it's important for us to have a kind of coherent approach to understanding the Sunnah of the Prophet. Okay, so when it comes to irregular, contradictory type of hadith, what's the approach been? And we've looked at this already, that it does depend on, to what degree the hadith is irregular. All right, so for instance, there are times when the hadith there are two hadith and they contradict, and it's actually because one has been abrogated. Right, there was a ruling that was there in the early days, and then later it changed. So, for instance, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi talks about the hadith of women being prohibited from visiting graves, and then another hadith about drawing animate objects, and that both of these were overturned later. We've talked about this. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but that's been discussed previously, and it's in previous notes as well. And then there are other times when the Sunnah was a kind of related to when the hadith was related to a specific context, but it's not the Sunnah. All right. So, for instance, there's a hadith in which the Prophet, this is Muslim, said to non-Muslims, advised Muslims, when you speak to non-Muslims, don't initiate the greeting. Don't say hello. Okay, wait for them to say something, and then say, and upon you. Yeah. Kind of like, and the same back to you, sort of thing. And then when you meet them in a path, try and push them to the narrowest corner of that path, which seems completely bizarre. We've looked at the context of that, and this is not the Sunnah. Of course, it's not the Sunnah. There's a specific context. So that hadith may have been authentic, but it has a very specific context, which was like a state of war with a group of people. It wasn't a general application in all situations. All right. There are times also when there are hadith which, they're authentic. The Prophet did it, said it, but it's not applicable today. So you don't have to apply it. It doesn't necessarily, you could say it could be the Sunnah in some contexts, but it's not applicable at the moment. So we have the example where Imam Malik in the Muwatta quotes the hadith, where the Prophet gave mahr, married somebody to someone else, and all the man could offer was verses of the Quran. Okay, but Imam Malik said, but actually we would require people to give some minimum monetary gift as well. Okay, so he's not accepting that hadith to be practiced. Okay, not that he doesn't accept its authenticity. If it's in Muwatta, it's authentic, right? And sometimes, what was said or done is because the Prophet ﷺ was a man of 7th century Arabia. So some of the medical advice he gave would have been based on whatever he knew then. He didn't have amoxicillin. He might have advised amoxicillin if he lived in a time when it was available. But then again, he wasn't a physician, so you don't necessarily have to require him to say things like that either. So there are examples. We've talked about this before as well. But he rode camels, he rode horses. We don't tend to do that today, but that's just what a person at that time would have done. Sometimes he didn't mean things literally, and the Prophet, as Jonathan Brown kind of very nicely explains, had a style of speaking which was hyperbolic, where everything was kind of said in a very emphatic way, where it sounds kind of more impactful. Okay, but that means that you don't necessarily then take it literally. You just enjoy the impact. You enjoy the language, right? And we use that a lot of times in our language anyway, right? When you actually break down the way that we say things, it's actually it's not literally meaning what we've said, but it's understood through the context, right? So things like the Prophet talking about Allah descending to the lowest third of the heavens, etc. And then there are things where it's just difficult to reconcile in any way at all. And then you have to, if it's an authentic chain, you might say, I'm going to park it. That's called shadh, okay, which is call it an irregular, anomalous hadith, that it's not going to be followed. Or you actually reject it. Okay, the scholars reject it, and that's called munkar, especially when the chain isn't strong. If it's weak, you just simply reject it. Okay, right. So let me just. Is there a danger if you're going to pick and choose that you lose the sunnah? So have a look at this diagram. What we're saying here is that if there are two axes, so along the top, you've got probability in terms of the content of the hadith, okay, where it becomes less and less consistent with the saying of a prophet, right? And along this side, you've got weaker and weaker and weaker. So on this side, over here, you've got a sahih that's mutawatir. Mutawatir means it's been corroborated by so many chains, you just don't have any doubt about it at all. Multiple chains. Mashhur is a good number of chains. Aziz is at least two chains. Gharib is an authentic, but just a single chain, a lone hadith, right? Okay, then you've got Hasan, which is where the content may not be exactly what the Prophet said, but it's reasonable. We talked about Hasan li ghayrihi last week, which is where you might have some weak hadith, but so many of them from independent chains that it makes it together probably good. Then you've got weak, which is da'if. Then you've got very weak, which is like, whoa, and then you've got outright fabrications. Okay, so if each of these points are hadith, okay, so some hadith have got a nice content, but that the content is in line with the sunnah. So this is the sunnah over here, and the principles of the Quran, the sunnah, etc. But it's not got a chain at all, or it's got a very weak chain. It's got massive gaps in the chain, right? So you can't say it came from the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Seek knowledge unto China sounds brilliant, but you can't say it's consistent with the Sunnah, but you can't say it's from the Prophet. It's mawdu', it's fabricated, right? The wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he has the greatest right to it, right? Beautiful. But there's lots of beautiful things out there, lots of things that people say that are consistent with the Sunnah, consistent with what we like, what we know to be the religion, but they're not the Prophet saying it, right? So that's what you have over here, okay? Then over here on the other side, you've got things that are consistent with the sunnah, and they've got phenomenal chains as well. All right, so this is definitely what the Prophet said. So you can see that, if we talk about things that are definitely part of the standard teachings, great. Then you've got some hadith which give sort of, somewhat disproportionate amount of rewards to part of the Quran, or to certain deeds, or punishments for certain deeds. Right. Then you have some prophecies about the future, which are generally rejected. Then you start with praises of people. And you can see that there are some hadith where the chains are good, but as you go more towards some of these things, you won't generally find mutawatir hadith. Right? There won't be that many chains. There'll be more like lone chains, or a few chains, right? Corroborating these things. Okay, and then you get to things that literally go against the sunnah, they're unbefitting of a prophet, against the Quran, or patently against reason. Now, along here, you can see that there will be some hadith that have good chains, usually lone hadith, right, or just a few chains that could fit into this category, right? And then there's lots that are weaker that you'll find going into the danger zones along here, the improbable zones. Yeah. So that's the way of looking at the overall spread. The sunnah, we could say, is this bit here. Okay, when you put lots and lots of hadith together, hadith of good quality chains with content that's consistent, that's consistent with the Quran, that may be consistent with what lots of companions have understood as well. There you get the idea of what the sunnah is. So for instance, ijma essentially is about, okay, what was the understanding of the companions together? That's essentially the way I understand ijma, right? So if they all understood something, even if you don't have the exact hadith for it, this is actually the sunnah, right? Yeah. So I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes of Imam Abu Yusuf, who was a student of Abu Hanifa, as you know, right? And this is his advice when it comes to hadith. And to be honest, in many ways, actually, I don't even need to go into the detail. If we can understand this, and we can understand the advice of, say, Abu Yusuf on this point, and what the practice of the Imams of the past was, you've got your framework now, right? You can come across hadith and you can say, if it's authentic chain, I'm going to park it, right? I don't have to follow. I know what sunnah is. I'm going to put that to one side, okay? If it's not even got an authentic chain, I'm not accepting it. It doesn't matter. Okay, you can do that with a clear conscience, honestly. So this is what Imam Abu Yusuf says. Okay, so this is the Imam of the Hanafi madhab. So he was a student of Abu Hanifa, but essentially he was the Imam of the Hanafi madhab in his own right, because he was trained by Abu Hanifa, and he sat with Abu Hanifa and debated with him and helped to make the understand to frame the understanding of the madhab. And he says, stay away from unusual hadiths. Hold fast to those hadiths that the community of scholars has accepted, which the people of fiqh recognize. So these are the scholars of we've talked about this before in previous videos, that there's not just scholars of hadith, but there are scholars of fiqh. These are scholars who understand the process of deriving rulings. Okay. So which the people of fiqh recognize, which are in harmony with the Quran and Sunnah. A hadith that goes against the Quran is not from the Messenger of Allah, even if sound narrators narrate it. Let me say that again. A hadith that goes against the Quran is not from the Messenger of God, even if sound narrators narrate it. Yeah, you'll find that you won't find mutawatir like that. There'll be lone chains if they occur, right? Someone along that chain has made a mistake. That's it. You don't accept it. Don't worry, you don't have to accept it, right? He also said, hadith multiplies so much that some hadith which are traced back through chains of transmission are not well known to legal experts, nor do they conform to the Quran and Sunnah. Beware solitary hadiths and keep close to the collective spirit of hadith. Yeah, so we see that here. Yeah, the idea of the collective spirit, where most of the hadith fall, and it's mostly in this area here, is the Sunnah. Okay, that's the framework. And I think, just follow what Imam Abu Yusuf said that, and you'll be fine. And remember that that's actually that's Islam. That's the religion that we're talking about. Okay. Um, in Aqidah, and this is agreed by all the madhabs, that firm belief has to be on hadith that aren't solitary, but they're established through multiple chains. Okay, so in other words, it's allowed for you to doubt single chains and to have a degree of uncertainty about them. You don't have to have a firm conviction in them, right? The aqidah, the creed, is what you firmly believe in, and that has to be established through multiple chains. And so to the point where for the Hanafis, any ruling, any law, any practice has to be also corroborated through multiple minimum mashhur level of hadith. Okay, so how do you end up with anomalous hadith sneaking in, you might say, to the corpus, to even books like Bukhari and Muslim? How's that happen? And it seems on the face of it to be difficult to understand, right? But follow this follow this reasoning. So I mean, Jonathan Brown has talked about this. What he says that initially people understood that there can be weak hadith here and there, or weaknesses in hadith, and there wasn't a problem. But in many ways, our kind of staunch adherence, particularly to Bukhari and Muslim, is a reaction to modern times. So that's what this quote is talking about, is that, when you've got the very edifice of a religion being put under threat, sometimes the reaction to that is to sort of, put down the barriers, to lower the drawbridge, no, to lift up the drawbridge, yeah, and say, this is the religion, and it might be irrational, but I'm going to take it and I'm going to hold on to it and I believe it. Do you see? But we don't, that's a reaction. It doesn't mean it's the right reaction. Okay, but follow this line of thinking. So if, for instance, we were to say that the Quran is 100% authentic, we say that the Quran is mutawatir, it's been preserved through multiple chains, all the companions read the Quran 5 times a day, they all recited it all in Ramadan, etc., etc. Everybody's corroborated that completely. Now, would you say, we all know that Bukhari is the next authentic after the Quran. Would you say that the Bukhari is as authentic as the Quran? And if you're going to say no, are you then saying, because Bukhari was compiled by one man, not by committee like the Quran was. The Quran was compiled by multiple committees, corroborated by all of the companions. Okay, so the level of authenticity and checking on that is on a different scale. Bukhari was collected by one man. Do we believe that Bukhari was infallible? If you believe that Bukhari was not infallible, that he was human, okay, then you have to accept that he must make mistakes. Yeah, you can't accept that in a book of that size, through the culmination of a life's work, is going to have no mistakes in it, surely, right? How could it be as faultless as the Quran? And if it's not as faultless, that means we're accepting that there's some degree of margin of error there. Yeah, it's not like they're saying what the Orientalists say, which is to throw out the baby with the bathwater, the whole thing. But it's to say that accept that there could be some errors here and there. Yeah, so that's the argument. So what we're asking really is, how does this happen? Yeah. So here we've got all of this. This is Hassan. This stuff here is Hassan going across. Hassan da'if jiddan, very weak, right the way to Mawdu', which is fabricated, right? Good all the way across to fabricated. All of this, we could say, I'm quite happy to accept that, okay, whatever the chain, some reasonable chains, but the Prophet, somebody says that's not what the Prophet said. I don't think that makes sense. Fine, I could drop it. What about when the chains are really good? So they're sahih, even if they're gharib or aziz, okay, but then it contradicts historical facts or science, the Quran, Sunnah, the character of the Prophet. How does that happen? what happened, what went wrong. And essentially, you could say that there are three possible things. So the first possible thing is that there's a hidden defect, that in the chain somewhere, Bukhari thought that the narrator was good, or Imam Muslim thought the narrator was good, but other people have said other things about that narrator. Okay, so somewhere along there's been a bit of a mix-up in who the narrator was, right? Sometimes Bukhari uses kunyas. He uses Abu this, which could be someone else. You see, so that's number one. Number two, that there is a tendency of the hadith scholars to be not so particular when it comes to hadith that are of less practical value. Okay, and I'll go on to that. And number three, that companions could make mistakes, and if you don't believe me, we'll look at that in a second. So the hidden defects, I mean, there's a lot about that, and some of it will be in the notes as well of examples of hidden defects. But we'll, sometimes this, where it's done intentionally, it's called tadlis, where you deliberately hide the defect in the hadith because you like the hadith so much. You say, okay, well, I know people ask too many questions about it. I'll use Abu so rather than his full name because I know people don't like that person, and they'll question me. So that's called tadlis, right? But otherwise, you could also sorry, just one second. You could also do it inadvertently, of course. Okay, grades of scrutiny. So let's take this hadith. So if you were to look at this book here, Misquoting Muhammad, great book by Jonathan Brown, he goes through a number of these hadith that are in Bukhari or in Muslim. And, they're just ones that, for instance, Jonathan Brown doesn't like the one where when the adhan takes place, then shaitan farts and runs away. Okay, he doesn't like that one. But look at this one. And this is one that we really do have difficulty accepting. We can't accept this. It's wrong on too many counts. That the hour will not be established until you fight with the Jews, and the stone behind which a Jew will be hiding will say, "Oh, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him." I mean, it's there are so many things about this. But anyway, so what he says is he explains how these kinds of hadith can end up in authentic collections like Bukhari and Muslim. And essentially what he's suggesting is that this hadith and some of the other problematic hadith, like the hadith about women, etc., quite denigrating towards women, are all in chapters of hadith or chapters of Bukhari where all the hadith narrators would not have been as particular. So right the way from the companion downwards, when they've heard it from the companion, they wouldn't be as particular, checking other chains, checking for the exact wording, etc., double checking for mistakes, etc., because they're just kind of like, they might advise, like, for instance, the one about where the Prophet said that, that the majority of people in hellfire are women. He actually says to women, do charity. So he might put it in the chapter of charity, and sort of like, when a woman reads that hadith, they're going to think, oh, I really need to give charity because I don't want to be one of the majority that are in hell, right? So that's the kind of rationale that would say, okay, it's got a good content, a reasonable content. The chain looks good, and all of the narrators along. So this is what Jonathan Brown is arguing, that what happens is that all the narrators along that chain, right the way to Bukhari, right the way to Muslim, just don't have the same level of scrutiny when they accept those hadith. Okay, so it's not that there's a problem with the narrators per se, but it's just that they all have two gears. They have the ultra strict gear for the hadith where it's really important, and the less so strict gear. And then a good example of that is, and we've done this before, we've covered this before, the use of gharib hadith by Tirmidhi. So Imam Tirmidhi, a student of both Bukhari and Muslim, in his collection has multiple gharib hadith in areas where it actually doesn't matter so much. Like, so for instance, du'as. Now, if you do a du'a which the Prophet did, that's nice. If you do a du'a from your heart, which you've made up yourself, is that any less nice? You know, you could say that that's got another virtue in it of its own. So it almost doesn't matter. But if someone says, oh, the Prophet made this dua, you don't have to be so exacting, because it's all du'as are good at the end of the day, right? So that's the argument. So 50% of the du'as are gharib, the single chain narrations that Imam Tirmidhi has got. Okay, so what he says is that basically, even though the narrators, and there may be more than one chain late in books like Bukhari and Muslim, but they've all gone into that kind of mode where they're not as strict. Okay, so that's how it happens. And then the third way, and this book, I really do recommend you get hold of this, have a read of it if you want to go into this subject in more detail. But I have got in the notes, some key salient features of the book, kind of distilled out really. So by all means, do have a look at that, because I think today we're really only going to have time to talk about the framework really. Okay. So in this book, there's a whole chapter on where the companions did make mistakes, and the companions were sort of called to account by other companions for it. So all the way back to the time of Abu Bakr, where if a companion said something, he'd want him to bring another witness to confirm that so he's not accepting the saying of a companion about the Prophet. He said, bring me someone else as well. And then there's an account here where Musa did exactly the same. Well, Umar radiallahu anh did exactly the same with Abu Musa al-Ashari, that he asked him to bring a witness for this hadith, right? Ibn Abbas says that they used to just accept hadith from one another until the time of the fitna, and then people started narrating all sorts of things and they became more strict. Aisha would frequently question what companions had said, right? So Abu Dharr and Abu Hurairah say that the Prophet said that the woman, the donkey, and the dog break salah. So they've said that. But Aisha said, no, that cannot be true. How can you liken us women to donkeys and dogs, she says. Right. Phenomenally sharp, subhanAllah. And he says, by God, I used to lie in front of the Prophet while he was praying, and it didn't break his wudu. He carried on, right? So she says that she just simply cannot be correct. And what's interesting, and this is an important point to realize, is that at the time of the companions, because they weren't all around the Prophet at one time, they used to pass stories about the Prophet around, back and forth, right? So it's quite easily conceivable that the mistake could occur at the level of the companion, right? And many of the hadith in Bukhari and Muslim have the companion not saying, I heard the Prophet say, but they say, an Rasulillah, right? According to, or about the Rasul. That Abu Hurairah said that the Prophet said, right? Rather than I heard the Prophet. So it's actually, indicating that it's a second-hand account. Okay. So Abu Musa al-Ashari himself says that whenever we faced a problem concerning a prophetic tradition, so the companions amongst themselves would have problems with some hadith, then we approached Aisha and found the academic solution with her, which is either to explain it or to, and here's an example of this one, okay, which is where somebody said that Abu Hurairah says that evil omens are in women, animals, and houses. And Aisha says that, basically rejects it and says that actually what the Prophet said is that in the time of Jahiliyyah, people used to have evil omens. You say that evil omens were women, animals, and the house, right? And in fact, this goes against the Quran as well, because we don't do evil omens. Muslims don't do evil omens, right? Yeah. So you could see that there's a mistake that's occurred. It was an innocent mistake, and Aisha corrected it. Yeah. So there's others as well where, and it's in the notes. It's in the notes. Where actually, it's either just clearly against the Sunnah, or it's against the Quran, actually, what's been narrated. And these are authentic narrations, and they're in the notes. What about scientific and historical facts? Okay, so historical facts, there's a hadith in Bukhari where the Prophet ﷺ, it says, Abu Hurairah says that the Prophet walked one day silently towards the market of Banu Qaynuqa. So Banu Qaynuqa was one of the Jewish tribes, and they used to live in the outskirts of Medina. If you've ever been to Medina and you've been to, is it called Dar al-Medina? It's one of this beautiful museum on the outskirts of the city. They've got maps, 3D maps of what Medina looked like at the time of the Prophet. So the city itself was quite tight, but way out in the suburbs is where the Jewish tribes used to live, right? So the Prophet once silently walked to the markets of the Jewish tribe, Banu Qaynuqa, okay, and sat in the courtyard of Fatima's residence. Now, Fatima's residence would not have been in Banu Qaynuqa. In fact, there's another narration where, and this is in Muslim, also authentic, where it says, until he reached the market of Banu Qaynuqa, then he returned until he arrived in the courtyard of Fatima. So his daughter would not have been living all the way out in the sticks, in the kind of villages, you might say, around Medina, which is where Banu Qaynuqa is. So there's a factual inaccuracy. There's another hadith in Muslim in which Abu Sufyan is supposed to have said, and Abu Sufyan accepted Islam at the conquest of Mecca. And he says, "O Prophet of Allah, grant me 3 things." And the Prophet agreed, and he said, "My daughter Habiba is the most beautiful woman in Arabia, and I will give her in marriage to you." But the Prophet had married Habiba before the hijrah to Abyssinia. He was already married to her a long, long time. She'd accepted Islam when the Prophet was still in Mecca, right? So, it's just a factually inaccurate. Okay, other historically inaccurate ones is a hadith in which Abu Dharr asked the Prophet which was the first mosque to be built, and the Prophet said Masjid al-Haram. And then which one was built after that? And he says Masjid al-Aqsa. And who built Masjid al-Aqsa? Sulaiman alayhi salam, right? And then I said, what was the time gap between them? He said 40 years. And that's just not true, right? Even if we accept our own narratives, that it's not 40, it's many, many generations, because the grandson of Ibrahim alayhi salam, the great-grandson was Yusuf alayhi salam, okay? And then when the 12 brothers settled in Egypt, many, 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 many generations later, Musa alayhi salam came, then they were freed, and then they settled in Palestine, and then the Masjid al-Aqsa was built, right? So we're talking about hundreds, if not 1,000 years later, just historically inaccurate. Okay. There are just many more hadith to that effect. Then you've got scientifically inaccurate. So, for instance, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani is a commentator of Bukhari, and is very deferential to Imam Bukhari. Usually, he will make every effort to justify a hadith, but when it came to the Adam alayhi salam being 60 cubits high, he says he can't accept that one because he's traveled around to ancient settlements and found that they all had the same height doorway, if not smaller. Okay. Then we have examples of hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ advised people of Medina that they shouldn't graft palm trees, and so they didn't, and then next year they didn't grow, and they said, well, what's going on? And then the Prophet ﷺ said that you have better knowledge of the affairs of your world. Okay, so you know that scientific hadith don't necessarily have to be a kind of valid as such, but okay. This hadith is narrated by Anas bin Malik, okay, in Sahih Bukhari, in which when Abdullah ibn Salam, the Prophet did hijrah straight away, he came to Medina. One of the Jewish rabbis, leading Jewish rabbis called Abdullah ibn Salam, came to the Prophet ﷺ and asked him 3 questions. One of those questions was, why does a child resemble his father, and other times he resembles his maternal uncle, right? Which basically means it resembles his mother, because the maternal uncle and the mother are going to resemble each other, right? And the Prophet says that essentially, whichever of the two during intercourse climax first, the child will resemble them. Now we know a lot more about genetics these days, and we know that's simply not true. But bear in mind that how old was Anas bin Malik at the time of Hijrah? He was 10 years old. And was he likely to have been there? He really would not have. It's highly improbable he was there. Okay, and if he was at the age of 10, how well would he have remembered it? So this is a second-hand account or a third-hand account. Then using the term like maternal uncle, we know that in Medina the women were generally very active in society. So would you have had to say it resembles maternal uncle, or would you have just said resembles a mother, right, rather than being so kind of shy about saying that it resembles a woman? Women were kind of cloistered later on in Islamic history. Yeah, there are many instances of this kind. There's another hadith where Abu Huraira says to the Prophet, the Prophet took hold of my hand and said, Allah created created on Saturday the earth, and on Sunday the mountains, and Monday the trees, on Tuesday misfortune, on Wednesday the light, and on Thursday spreading it animals, and on Friday late afternoon he created Adam. Okay. And another hadith that were it not for the children of Israel, food would never become rotten and meat would never putrefy. And were it not for Eve, no woman would ever become unfaithful to her husband. So, just difficult to accept these. We know that that's just scientifically not possible. And then the whole thing about woman being unfaithful from Eve, the Quran doesn't state that. The Quran actually speaks quite differently about the Adam alayhi salam and Hawa equally making that mistake. And it's actually a biblical interpretation that Adam was tempted by Eve. And you can't. And do you blame all women in future? Do you blame Eve for all the sins of women afterwards? Again, inconsistent with the teachings of Islam. Yeah. Then there are. I'm going to just give you the notes because I think we have to wrap up. But there are notes which will explain how there are instances where the Quran is contradicted in the Hadith as well. For instance, this one here, where the angel of death came to Musa alayhi salam and he punched the angel of death in the face. And then, one commentator says, because he came as a human, so he could be punched. Okay. But then there's actually an ayah of the Quran which says that when death approaches one of you, our angels take his soul and they never fail in their duty. So, it's just going completely against the teachings of the Quran there. Okay. There's many instances of that kind. So, I think when it comes to fabricated hadith, there are so many. There's examples of those here as well, taken from the writings of Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn al-Jawzi as well. I'll share all of those in the notes. So let me just conclude now. I hope you've got an idea that there are hadith that are going to cause consternation. And that from the teachings of our own scholars, we are not obliged to accept them. And in fact, scholars have gone through a lot of trouble to kind of find sometimes the weakness in the chains, and otherwise you can actually just reject them outright if they just go completely against science. That's not a problem at all. Okay. I just want to wrap up with couple of quotes, if I might. Just trying to find them. Here we are. Okay. So what I want to do is just ask this final question. That look, isn't there a danger if we're going to start picking and choosing our hadith? Okay. Remember, we're not picking and choosing. We're actually choosing to stick to the hadith that, as Abu Yusuf said, we stick to the hadith that stay consistent with the character of the Prophet. I apologize, I didn't talk about that hadith in Bukhari. where the Prophet talked about women being deficient. Okay, suffice it to say that Ibn Abbas in Bukhari says that the most pious of people are women, right? And this is Ibn Abbas's own opinion, but it's in Bukhari. That just shows that this idea was in no ways widespread. Okay, that hadith could not have been widespread. Ibn Abbas has actually got a completely different opinion about women. Okay, so it just shows that that hadith is anomalous. It's not consistent with what the Prophet would teach. Okay, so anyway, but it's in the notes. Have a look, and or better still, read that book. It's only, I think, it was £5 on Kindle. It's not, it's not a hard buy by any means. So the point is, there is actually no danger for us in being particular about which hadith we accept as being consistent with the Prophet and which ones we're actually going to park, right, or outright reject. Okay, and you will find scholarly backing for this. Don't worry. Okay, it's not that you'll be on your own, but even if you're making that decision in your heart, then so what? That's fine. Remember, you could say, well, are we judging, say, especially the hadith that seem to be denigrating towards women? Are we judging the teachings and judging the Prophet by our modern standards? And what I would say to that is that, look, if you look at the comments of lots of these scholars and the scholars that actually accepted the hadith, accepted weak hadith and wrote about them, they were judging women by their own standards, which we would today think of as, quite unacceptable. And the bottom line is that Islam is always understood through the lens of the context, through the lens of the norms of the people of the time. Okay, but we don't need to feel guilty about that. By understanding it that way, what we actually do is we empower ourselves to detach ourselves from judging the past, because we're saying that that was an interpretation of Islam that was nurtured, created by that context. Okay, each scholar is a child of their context, and we will be child of our context, and we might be judged in years to come if people want to, or they might be a bit more charitable and just say, well, this was their context and that's how they understood their religion. Okay, we have to be able to have an understanding of our deen which is truly consistent with the noble vocation of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the noble teachings of the Sunnah. Okay, an understanding that actually gives us a confidence in our hearts that yes, this is the right religion, and this is a religion that brings a light to people's lives, and it allows us and it empowers us to be people who can be impactful in society and can be morally consistent in society as well. You can't be standing up for the rights of women whilst believing that they're mentally and religiously deficient. How can you believe that and yet want equality for women? Do you see? So we have to have an understanding that actually creates that moral consistency. And wallahi, that is the way of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Okay, so I think that's all really I wanted to end on. And remember that when scholars are judging, and they're judging based on their contextual lens, okay, they will still get a reward if they meant well and they've looked at the evidences sincerely. They still get a reward, and that hadith is here in Bukhari, right in front of us. Right, that you get 2 rewards if you're right and 1 reward if you're wrong. And throughout time, people have been changing their opinions depending on their context. And there's a very important, we've mentioned this in previous talks, where the great scholars like Ibn al-Qayyim have talked about how important it is that judgments are made based on context and based on understanding the norms of the time. Okay, that's. I'm sorry, this was a very long one because we have to conclude this topic today. There is a lot more material in the notes, which I'll tidy up and pass out to you, inshallah, shortly. I hope that I'm just having a look at the questions. Yeah, so I think we've answered that the question, which was about how do we know which ones to park and which ones not to park, essentially. Okay, so yeah, I hope that we've been able to help in understanding how to find the Prophet in amongst the hadith, essentially, right? And when we find the Prophet, he is a person that is going to enable us to become agents of positive change in society. That fundamentally, that is what we're meant to be, right? If the Sunnah distracts us from that, we haven't understood the Sunnah, right? If we've understood the Sunnah properly, if we understand the Quran properly, then it's fundamentally teaching us that we have to get out there and affect people's lives. We have to be beacons of light and hope and positivity in the lives of people around us, inshallah. Okay, I'm just going to hand over to Sarah to finish off with some announcements. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر